Okay, so just to kind of give you guys a rundown of what the plan is. So for today, we're going to start off with the speeches that you guys prepared for homework. So we'll begin with that. I'm going to take notes and give you guys feedback. If you remember from last week, we're going to try the whole standing up thing for this week, which um, I know seems a little strange on camera, but we're going to give it a try. It's really helpful so that way you can get in the habit of practicing the presentation of the speech in the way that you would the day of the tournament. And I can also see your posture, your hand gestures, and kind of get an idea of that and give you feedback on that as well. So we'll give it a try. Last class, it worked out well actually without the headphones because I know the headphones pull sometimes if you stand too far. So we'll kind of play around with that, but hopefully after today, we'll kind of be more comfortable with that. So we'll start with the speeches. I'll give you guys feedback that way you know kind of what to personally work on. And then I may bring in like a topic or two just to talk about, but the goal is that at the end, the last 15 minutes or so, I plan on releasing the resolution. So the resolution is officially confirmed. They were working on the wording of it for a while, but it's officially set. So at the end of the session, I will share that with you. And then together we'll just kind of brainstorm ideas on both ends. And then next week, your homework actually for this week is going to be to start outlining a case, not writing a case, just outlining. So not researching anything yet, just thinking about your evidence and how that would flow once you actually get the resolution. But the goal is that by next week, you'll have your partnership. So if you didn't do the Google form that I posted on Classroom, I think it's called like partnerships. Please do make sure you do that so that way I can take that into account. If you don't have a preference, just indicate that on the form and then you can submit it that way. So that way, after next week, you can actually start working with your partner and actually working on the actual case. So that way we can prepare for that. Any questions on that plan? Okay, sounds good. Okay, thanks for the thumbs up. Okay, so I guess we'll just get started with the speeches since there's 6 of us. Is there anyone who wants to volunteer to go first? So you all have to go. So anyone want to get it out of the way? Is that kind of a hand, Gavin? Is that you indicating that you really, really want to go? No? Okay, I'll maybe pick you second or something. Mitchell, let's start with you. So
Okay.
if you have if you typed out like if you typed out a speech, you can kind of do the split screen unless you have like an outer camera. If you use like note cards or something, you can just hold on to it while you're delivering.
Okay, I use note cards.
Okay, perfect. And then yeah, we're gonna do the standing up thing, and then hopefully you guys remember this from like the summer camp. But normally before you start a speech, you would ask, you know, partner ready, opponent ready, judge ready, and then you start the clock. So you would say, my time starts now, and then I would begin the clock that way. For this one, you want to try to keep it within 2 to 3 minutes. So I'll time it just to kind of give you an idea of, you know, how close you were to that range. But just make sure you get in the habit of starting the clock so that way we're preparing in that sense.
Should I do the partner ready, opponent ready, that stuff?
No, we'll just kind of skip that part for now
Okay.
and then just start with the time. So my time starts now.
Okay. My time starts now. I did some research on voter fraud. There's been a big debate about voter fraud, and it mostly sparked after Donald Trump blamed losing the popular vote on voter fraud and dead people voting. There's no denying that it happens, but the real debate is about how often it happens and how much of a problem it is. So then, what we do know is a report by Judicial Watch in 2014. There were 2,500 counties studied, and 462 over 100% of the population registered to vote. So over 100% of the population that was alive was voting, was registered anyway. For example, New Mexico, Hardin County had 162% registration rate. Washington Clark County had 154%, and Los Angeles County had 112%. In California, the state of California, there were 1,736,556 ghost voters, meaning they were registered to vote and they were dead. All of this added up, it comes out to about 3.5 million people who are dead and still registered. Here's the thing, though. Voter registration expires after 2 years, and the death rate is about 2.5 million people in the U.S. 2.5 million people die per year. And then of that 2.5 million people, 3.5 are still registered to vote. So chances are there's something that is happening with people who are voting and are dead. But the thing is, we don't know how much this is because it's very hard to figure out who's doing what. Between 2000 and 2012, but according to the Wall Street Journal, there were about 1,000 proven cases of voter fraud. But because of the dead voters, the registered voters who are dead, we don't know how many are actually voting. That's a real question, and that's what the debate is about. And because of this, people have been pushing things like voter ID laws, and then opposition, they say that, well, we don't know how many is voting, and then the numbers we do have, it's tiny. And then the people supporting it, they say, well, it must be a lot more because we're not catching enough. Maybe if we do these laws, then we'll catch more. But we really don't know. It's a really hard issue. And what it really comes down to is, how do we figure out who's voting illegally? And until we know that, we cannot make any policy. We cannot make any policy or any of that. Pretty sure I'm pretty much done.
Okay. Perfect. That was like exactly 3 minutes. I'm writing up some notes before I forget. Okay, so anyone want to go next? Jonathan, let's go to you, if you don't mind.
But you said Gavin was going second.
Is it second or third?
All right. I did it on a computer, so.
Okay, that's fine. Just try to kind of look back and forth to the camera, that way we can assess your.
All right. So I did mine on the Voting Rights Act. So the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was also nicknamed the Act to Enforce the 15th Amendment of the Constitution, because it was signed into law 95 years after the 15th Amendment was passed. In previous years, African Americans in the South had faced tremendous obstacles to actually voting. Like, for example, there were poll taxes, literacy tests, and other restrictions imposed on them. And so the Voting Rights Act was passed to block this kind of discrimination and blocking of voters. And beforehand, African Americans, very few of them were registered voters, and they had very little political power locally and nationally. And according to the Constitutional Rights Institute, after the Civil War, the South was under military rule, and under this, many blacks started to vote, and they primarily voted Republican because that was the party of Lincoln. But then, after military rule ended, people decided many whites were white supremacists, and they decided to change this. And the Ku Klux Klan was created, and many African Americans stopped voting because they were threatened by their white employers or members of the Ku Klux Klan to not vote, otherwise harm would be issued to them or they would lose their jobs. And so these Republicans that were voted in from the South lost power because their base, which was primarily African American, ended. And then the Democrats took over, and during that time, the Democrats, for example, in Mississippi, decided to create a different state constitution where they created these poll taxes and literacy tests, and these literacy tests were primarily hard passages for African Americans, but when it came to white people, they had easier passages. And another benefit of for the Democratic Party, in a sense, was that when they created the new state constitution in Mississippi, was that they decided to pass a grandfather clause, which meant that if your grandfather voted, then you could vote, but if your grandfather did not vote, then you had no chance of voting. And this segregation was also implemented by many other states after Mississippi, and the segregation would continue until 1954, when Martin Luther King would start to fight for civil rights, and eventually the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed.
Okay, Gavin, you are up.
Okay. Is my microphone on?
Yeah, but your camera isn't on. We just have the beautiful site that you chose to display for us.
Oh, the camera icon instead of the microphone icon.
Okay. So, did you do it on a note card, or did you type anything out, or are you just going to deliver it?
I did it online.
Okay. Are you able to look at it and the camera a little bit?
Yeah, I got it on split screen.
Oh, okay, perfect.
I did it on Selma, which was one of the major events leading up to the Voting Rights Act of '65, which Jonathan just talked about. So Selma was a battleground for Black voting rights. Since the early '60s, African American citizens were given the right to vote, but in order to register for voting right to vote, they had to take extremely biased and difficult literacy tests, poll taxes, moral character tests, and meet property ownership requirements and other bias standards that were not given to the white population, thus basically nullifying their voting rights. Yet in this opposition, Martin Luther King Jr. sought to change that and began movements in Alabama to change these and gain a more fair way to register and access their voting rights. However, fierce opposition existed in the form of terror and cruelty, either through the KKK and their church bombing or the Alabama government. The latter did not appreciate such movements and took care of them by mass arrests, beatings, cruelty, which were all spearheaded by Sheriff Jim Clark, which culminated in the murder of Jimmy Lee Jackson, who was shot to death in a cafe after police brutally dispersed a crowd. And in response to this, King organized a march on Highway 80 from Selma to Montgomery, but refused to use violence as he was a pacifist. This didn't sit too well with Governor Wallace, who ordered Jim Clark to use whatever measures are necessary to prevent a march, which ended in Bloody Sunday, in which the Alabama policemen charged the unarmed crowd on horseback, fired tear gas into the crowd, and beat dozens of protesters bloody. That did not escape in time. And this was captured on camera and televised across the nation, which gained a lot of support for the Selma movement and caused great backlash against the Alabama government. And day two saw the protesters stop at the bridge and just pray and turn back. And 3 activists were assaulted by the KKK that night, and one of them died a few days later because he got hit on the head too hard. So King did manage to convince LBJ to pass the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which gave African Americans the right to enter unbiased voting registrations. And so he completed his march on the 3rd day. where he managed to march to Montgomery and he gave a speech. And although Viola Luizzo was murdered a few hours later by the KKK, her death was not in vain, as more fair voting rights were finally put in place. And Selma is a representation of grit, determination, and sacrifice that shows Americans fighting for their rights and going against all odds to achieve them. That's why I chose Selma.
Thank you. So we have a Tim, let's go to you.
Okay. Let's see if we can get this camera thing to work.
And not fall down.
Right. Does this work?
Yeah, we see you clearly. And then just make sure you start the clock. So, oh.
Right.
Okay, hopefully it's stable. Yeah, just make sure you start the clock by saying, my time starts now. And then, yeah. That's it.
All right, my time starts now. According to dictionary.com, gerrymandering is, quote, the dividing of a state, country, etc. into election districts so as to give one political party a majority in as many districts as possible while concentrating the voting strength of the opposite party into as few districts as possible. That definition is a little convoluted on first glance, so let's dive a little deeper. Each state is divided into districts. These districts are used to elect positions such as the House of Representatives, state legislators, and some local offices. According to publicmapping.org, these districts are redrawn following a census to adjust for population changes. These districts are usually drawn by state legislatures. This is all well and good, so long as the districts actually make sense. However, in states where one party controls most of a legislature, they may seek to keep it that way through gerrymandering. Essentially, gerrymanderers draw strange district lines that seem to make no sense. However, a deeper look finds that they are drawn to ensure that their party wins the next election. An easy way to do that would be to draw districts that are almost entirely of the opposite party, while keeping your party in the 51 to 60% majority in all other districts. This would allow a party to keep winning elections without having the majority support of the people if done properly. This is a very real problem in today's society because, we already have a government where popular vote isn't necessarily the biggest indicator, as evidenced by our electoral college. But it shouldn't be possible to be outnumbered by 70 to 30% and still win elections year after year because of unfair political practices. Thank you. That's all I have.
Zhang, let's go to you.
All right. I'm just trying to see if this works. Move back. All right. I think this works. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you clearly and you see perfectly.
Okay, so my time will start now. So I did my research topic on Lani Guinier. And so Lani Guinier is an American civil rights theorist, and around the 1970s, she was the head of the voting rights projects for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Having this position, she helped win major voting rights cases in southern states. Around 1993, President Clinton nominated her to be the first Black woman to be the head of the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice. And she previously was a civil rights attorney for more than 10 years and had served in the Civil Rights Division during the Carter administration. After her name had been put forward, conservatives attacked her Guinier's views on democracy and voting, thus influencing Clinton to abruptly withdraw her nomination without a confirmation of hearing. That experience then led Guinier to use her public platform to speak out on issues of race and democratic decision-making. She published a series of books on her views and commitment to social justice, and she brought her books forth and her books brought forth a national discussion about the meaning of democracy. Around 1998, Guinier joined the Harvard Law School faculty, and there she became the first African American woman that was a tenured professor in the law school's history. Now, over the course of her life, her actions had led her to win numerous prizes, such as winning the 1995 Margaret Brent Women's Lawyers of Achievement Award from the American Bar Association's Commission on Women in the Profession of the Rosa Parks Award from the American Association for Affirmative Action, and the Harvey Levin Teaching Award, and finally, the 2002 Sachs Friend Teaching Award from Harvard Law School. That's all I have.
All right, thank you. And then last but not least, we have Divin.
Yeah. Oh, okay. 1 minute.
Is there a way to, either move? Oh, okay. I think that works.
Okay, so my time starts now. I did my research presentation on how social class and background affects voter turnout and voting. So even though the United States government has passed many laws preventing suppression of voter rights based on color, the suppression of right based on racist acts is still a big problem today. A lot of this was brought into highlight with the upcoming midterm elections, where in Georgia, a bus full of African American voters, registered voters, was stopped because politicians feared that they would vote for the opposite party in a primarily Republican area. Also, adding to this topic, in a political climate such as ours, where people are jailed wrongfully based on race and color, the suppression of their vote based on criminal acts takes away their opportunity to correct these mistakes made by the government, which not only helps the government continue its corrupt acts, but also leads to supremacy based on color. Coming to class, the social class and wage, our current voting methods don't give much flexibility to people of lower class or people who work for daily wage as a prospect of them leaving their jobs even for a day to turn out and vote. Takes away their opportunity to make money to provide for them and their family. And since people who are of lower class are more likely to vote for a party that represents them and the ability for them to go get money, a ruling party may easily suppress their vote. And yeah, that's all I have.
Okay, so I'm just gonna give you guys some feedback so that way you can just think about this stuff moving forward. Okay, so I'll just go in the order that you guys presented it. So Mitchell, you started us off. Okay, so Mitchell, I'll start with you. Can you hear me fine? Thank you. All right, so okay, so I like the way that you started your speech because you talked about why it's an important topic, and you talked about specifically with voter fraud, why, how it became a thing in the Trump era where more people became aware of this idea of voter fraud. But then you kind of mentioned how, although it's been in recent news, it's always been a problem, which I think was a great introduction because you had an introductory element to the topic that I think kind of laid out the expectation pretty well. I think you did a good job overall. You gave a good number of facts and evidence, 3.5. So I even took notes, 3.5 million ghost votes. You have good pacing in your delivery and you use good eye contact. At times it can be a little choppy. So I did put a note that it doesn't sound natural at certain points, which is fine because right now we're not very comfortable with the topic and we're not very familiar with it. But as we work towards writing the case and presenting parts of the case, you will be more familiar with it and it will sound more natural. I put to add, like a note to add more passion in your voice as well, because, and it's not just for you, but I think for all of us, voting rights, because of the nature of the topic, it can be very dry and it can sometimes be very overwhelming because there's a lot of information within it. So it's really important to make sure you have the passion and you have that strength in your voice to really grasp our attention and really connect to what you're saying. Because with a topic like this, it would be very easy to lose focus with you if you don't sound passionate or convincing in your delivery in itself. So just something to think about, and not just you, but I think for all of us to think about. One thing I do think you did really well, because you picked voter fraud, I think it was very strategic of you to kind of narrow down into one strand of voter fraud, specifically with the dead people voting, because I think it's such a broad topic. And if you're asked to give an informational speech in 2 to 3 minutes, it would be overwhelming if you were to talk about all these different strands as well. So I think you organize it pretty well to give us one branch within it, so that way we don't feel overwhelmed. You explained, yeah, I think you led everything pretty well. So at the end, you started talking about, why we have those voter ID laws, and overall, you explained the topic well. I think one thing, this is kind of minor, but at one point you cited a Wall Street Journal. So you said, like, according to a Wall Street Journal, and then you gave evidence, which was good because you had a citation there. But one thing we're going to work on as we move towards finding evidence for the case is finding that original study rather than citing an article about the study or another source that refers to the numbers or the statistics. So just one thing to think about as well for all of us is trying, which is hard, I know, for something like this, but as we work towards finding evidence for the case, trying to find those original studies so that way we have the concrete citations. But yeah, so I think overall you did really good. Yours was exactly 3 minutes. So, and because you had good pacing, I think it worked out well where it's not like you were cramming a lot of information in those 3 minutes. I think you laid it out pretty well. Just work on, again, sounding more natural and sounding more comfortable with the topic and the passion. So making sure that you actually sound like you care about this topic. Because with a topic like this, again, it's very easy to lose focus if it doesn't come across as passionate and strong. But I think you did really good overall. Okay, so I'll go to Jonathan. So Jonathan, you were next. Just put you up on here. There, okay. So Jonathan, I think you did a good job as well overall. So you gave really good background information to your topic, which it was all about kind of the history and everything leading up to that. So I think you did a good job with that. You talked about the literacy test, the poll taxes. So it was very easy to just follow along with what it is that you were leading up to. So I think you did a good job bringing in information. Your delivery also needs a little bit of work because it was very choppy at certain parts. So there were moments where it seemed like you were too dependent on like the card or the speech that you were reading through, which again, at this point, a lot of us are because we're not familiar with the facts and the numbers and the statistics and all of the information, which is normal. But as we work towards familiarizing ourselves with the topic, that will help you sound more natural and not as choppy because you're just reading through it. So there were a lot of ims. You were a lot of ums, a little bit stiff. But I did put a note. I think once you familiarize yourself with the topic, it will come across much more naturally. I think you had good eye contact, and I think you projected your voice pretty well, which is good. One thing to just be careful of, and again, I think it's because of the nature of this topic, especially voting rights in general. And I think all of us can benefit from this. When delivering the information, try not to be too wordy. So you want to strategically think about how you're phrasing the sentence, because it seemed like you were kind of listing a lot of facts leading up to things. And I think with the nature of, you talked about the Voting Rights Act and the progression in that, I think kind of finding a balance between storytelling and fact delivery, I think would help us connect more to
Sorry about the disconnect.
I know it's okay. To what it is that you were saying. So just something to think about in general. So because again, there's a lot of information that has to do with the topic, just making sure that you're finding a balance so it's not just throwing facts at us, but making sure you're even narrating certain events so that way we're easily able to follow along and it kind of breaks the facts a little bit. But like I said, I think you gave a good amount of information. It was very informative, which was the purpose of the speech. The ending was a little abrupt, and it wasn't just you. A couple of you had that as well. And just one thing to think about, because when we do present the case, if you run out of time and like, the judge gives you the 30-second warning or, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, just jump to like a final sentence, like a final line to give closure. So even if it's like an attack speech, it would just be like, and these are the reasons why our opponent's contentions do not stand. So just kind of have something as a go-to or just kind of recap everything. So that way, even if you're to run out of time, you're able to bring it closure. Yours was 3 minutes and 15 seconds, which I wasn't giving you time cues. So I'm not gonna, be too hard on you for that. But just always think about rule of thumb. If you realize you're running out of time and you're still not through most of your speech, find a way to give closure so it doesn't feel abrupt when it does end. Okay, but again, well done overall. Okay, Gavin, you went next. Okay, so you talked about Selma and why it was important, which I think is really good because also just telling us why we should know about this topic is very helpful to the listener. So one thing I want to commend you on, I think you did really good, is that your passion actually came through. And like I said, with a topic like this, it's very easy to lose you if you're monotone or you're not really excited because again, it's very informative. But I think because you had that passion, you were talking about it like it's something that actually matters and we should all know about. That was 50% of the job right there. So I think you did a really good job with that. You also gave really good background information leading up to the event. So it was very informational, which again was the purpose of it. It was hard to assess your body language. I don't know if you ended up sitting down or what happened. But also just in your posture should also seem a little more natural. I think at certain points, it also sounded robotic, like you were kind of just reciting what was in front of you. And again, as we familiarize ourselves with the topic, that part will hopefully be an easy fix overall. But I think you did really good. You had good volume and pace. It did get choppier towards the end, but you did have some sort of closure. So it was 3 minutes and 25 seconds. But, had you had that 30-second warning, I think you would have been able to kind of think on the spot with how you wanted that. But I'm glad you thought about how you wanted to end it. So that way it felt like a unified speech. So good job with that. Tim. Okay, so Tim, you went. Tim, can you hear me?
I hear you.
Okay, I just want to make sure that was you. Okay, so you picked a great topic, gerrymandering, which actually was one of the things I was going to talk about after this. So I'm glad you attacked that. You had a hook, so I think yours was the definition, right? So the definition defines gerrymandering as, and then you went from there. So one thing all of us can think about is, again, making sure you're not just starting by saying, okay, here's my topic, here I go kind of thing, but actually trying to hook the audience, which I was glad that you kind of thought about, what's the first line going to be. I think you laid the information pretty well, so it was definitely easy to follow along with you, and I think you did a good job with your goal of the speech is to essentially help us understand the topic, which I think you did efficiently. So I wrote that you had good voice projection, good pacing, good hand gestures. You're also a little too dependent on like the written speech, so making sure that you're again not too dependent on that and making it sound more natural. Your hand ended up in your pocket at one point, so just make sure that you are not being too informal, which I know with the camera screen it feels awkward, but as we practice that, we want to try to be as formal as possible. You did cite, I think, a website at one point. You said, according to publicmapping.org. So again, this isn't like a huge deal, but as we work on the actual case, you never cite websites because the judge is not going to like Google the website, but you want to cite the actual study or, who conducted this statistic or whatever it may be, or the researcher or the person, and then give us a little insight on them. But, it's fine for this, but just one thing to just think about. But I think you did really well overall. You connected the importance of the topic, like to today's world. And I think your speech definitely got much stronger the second half because it just seems to just come together more by the end. So just making sure you're consistent with that. But overall, I think it was really well put together. Okay, next was Shizong. Okay, so Shizong, and all of you again did a really good job. So Shizong, I think I mentioned this to you the first day we did the impromptus, but I think you just have a natural like talent for delivering information. So I think just the nature of your voice helps because you have a powerful voice that I think helps obviously with structure and organization, help us connect to what it is that you're saying and help kind of grasp our attention. So I think you naturally have good delivery because of that. But one thing to just be mindful of is against kind of a theme that was going on, just sounding more organic and more natural. And again, not being too dependent on the note card. It seemed like it wasn't rehearsed on your end, and it seemed like you weren't comfortable yet delivering it, which again is normal. You probably weren't. I hope you didn't just do this the night before. But you know, as we familiarize ourselves with the topic again, hopefully that would be an easy fix because you will be more comfortable with the topic and you would have it rehearsed. I did put a note that you can use more eye contact and hand gestures just to think about, again, just making you like, if as long as you look comfortable and feel comfortable up there, we will feel comfortable up there watching it and listening into you. I think you explained the topic pretty well. So, you know, you gave us a lot of information about who she is and everything we need to know. I think with a topic like this, it would be helpful to kind of connect it more like on the broader aspect, like why is it that people like, you know, like Lady are important to know, and just kind of give it more purpose, I think, because it kind of just, I think that's the only thing it was missing was kind of like, okay, now I know who this person is, but what's the point? So kind of thinking about the broader picture, which we'll talk more about when we talk about the case. It's something we do more in the summary and way at the end, but something to think about when giving one speech is what is the purpose of the speech and how to connect that to the audience. Because again, a topic like voting rights is not easy because depending on who your judge is, they may not have a natural interest in voting rights. Not many people do. And I'll admit, I'm not one who knows a lot about voting rights, and it's not a topic that naturally grasps my attention. So just thinking about how you're going to make the topic more meaningful and always connecting it back to today's world, because that's something that anything we talk about is about today's world, and anyone can connect to that in that aspect. Yes, I think yours was good. You know, you did end by saying that's all I have. So just making sure you have that closure, and then after that you can kind of put that little comment in. But yeah, other than that abrupt ending, I think it was well put together though as a whole. Okay, and then last but not least, Divin. All right, so Divin. Okay, so Divin, I think you picked a really good topic. So I think it was an excellent topic because of just the nature of it. But you definitely lacked passion. And for a topic like this, like I think when you first introduced the topic, you said, you know, I'm going to be talking about social class and background and how that correlates to voter turnout. And I was already hooked because it seemed like such an important topic. But you didn't sound too interested in the topic itself. And remember, you have to sound passionate. You have to sound convincing, because if you don't sound like you are really believing what you're saying, we're not going to believe what you're saying. So half the work, and I used to always tell my kids, it's not just what you say, it's how you say it. And, you know, a good salesman can sell air if they wanted to. It's really how you put it together and how you convince the audience of the importance of your topic in order to be successful with that. So just making sure you have the passion for the topic. And again, as we get more comfortable and rehearse it, I think that will come. But even with something like this, it's practice, because if you're thrown into something and you have to give a speech, you have to pretend like it's something you've always cared about, and it's something that you're speaking kind of from the heart. So I think overall, though, you did good because you weren't too dependent on the note cards, which is good. It was choppy, though. So as a whole, kind of going back to, again, the lacking passion, I think branching off from that, it just didn't sound as natural. And like I said, we all need to rehearse and we all need to familiarize ourselves with the topic. So that's expected, but just something to be aware of. So there were a lot of like ums in the speech, just swaying. But again, as we familiarize, I think that's something we would be able to work on. I think just one thing strategically thinking about the topic you chose, I think it would have made the speech a little stronger had you brought in like a personal not a personal, but like a testimonial example or something from someone who feels like their voice isn't heard, or just someone from like a minority or a lower social class, so we can see what they are feeling. And I think bringing in those pathos and that emotional appeal may help us connect more to your topic, because again, it was an excellent topic, but an important one, which I think you definitely would want to draw on the emotional aspect with that. So yeah, like I think you ended by saying it's easy to suppress votes for the lower class. So I wish you cited like one person's testimonial experience with that, or something to just make me connect a little bit more. Okay, sorry guys, I know that was a lot. Like I'm throwing information at you. I do have this typed out, so if you ever miss anything I say, or you want it in writing, just let me know and I can email it to you or message it to you. Are there any questions on anything so far? Okay. All right, so Mitchell and Divin, if you can turn on your cameras, because that is part of the rule. So Tim, what happened? Did you get logged out?
My phone died.
Oh.
And
okay.
my computer does not have a webcam.
Okay, that's fine. It makes sense, because now I know why you're on the phone. Okay, that's fine. So just make sure you fully charge next time, because it does drain the battery. Okay, so we have about 15 minutes. So I think we're just going to jump right to the resolution. So I'm going to share my screen in just a second. I posted a slide deck on Classroom. I think it was just titled Voting Rights. And it just kind of went through like very simply like different like historical timelines to voting and just different topics to think about. So if you haven't gotten a chance to look through it, definitely look through it if you can. It's not very long, but I think it just does a good way of just giving some helpful information. There is a video on there about gerrymandering, which I was going to show, but since Tim, I think, was the one who chose it as this topic, I think he did a good job explaining that. But just one thing to keep in mind with the nature of the topic with voting rights, it's just building the foundation of the topic. So understanding things like gerrymandering and, who these important figures are, and just the nature of the topic, because as you know from experience in the summer camps and other debates, it's not just presenting your case and memorizing your evidence, but being able to actually defend it, being able to actually find the flaws in your opponent's points as well. And in order to do that, you have to know all the points on both ends. So just one thing to think about as we're getting closer to the tournament is just reading through as much as you can about the topics and current events, things that you can bring in at different points throughout the debate. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen because I pretty much made a little document that I figured we just kind of start brainstorming together, and then next week again you'll have your partnerships and we'll be able to be more focused through that. So let me do this first, and then okay. So hopefully you guys can see my screen. Okay, so pretty much this document I'm going to post on Classroom, so that way we can refer back to it and always go back to it. But here is the resolution. So the resolution states, the protection of voting rights should outweigh concerns of maintaining a secure election. Again, the protection of voting rights should outweigh concerns of maintaining a secure election. So it's a two-part resolution. I kind of broke it down with the affirmative, the pro end, and the negative, the con end. Essentially, if you're on the affirmative, you are arguing that the protection of voting rights is more important than maintaining a secure election. So for the reasons, that's something we can think about, but that's essentially what the pro side is arguing. The negative side, so if you're negating the resolution on the con side, you are essentially arguing that maintaining a secure election, so I wrote election integrity here, so things like voter fraud, interference, hacking, all of these things essentially outweigh the protection of voting rights for certain groups. So thinking about, why we have certain state laws that may not protect the voting rights of all Americans, but your job on the negative side is to bring up those laws and think about why they're important to have, because they are there to maintain a secure election, which you're arguing is more important than having the protection of voting rights. Are there any questions so far on just what the resolution is saying or is implying? I mean, that's my interpretation of it, but essentially what I wanted to do today is just kind of together think about just different ideas, not researching anything yet, but just different ideas that would go on both sides. And then as we get closer, you will be able to spend time actually researching and looking through it. So just remember, at Capital Debate, we're not hoarding evidence or anything like that. We're kind of brainstorming together, but once you, again, have your partnerships, you'll be able to actually focus on your individual case. And then I would be the one actually reading through it and giving feedback that way. So would anyone want to start us off in terms of what you're thinking, like anything that can possibly go on the affirmative or anything that would possibly go on the negative side, in terms of topics or even just ideas? It's just brainstorming, so there's not it doesn't necessarily have to be something that we essentially use, but just something to think about in terms of what goes on either end.
The first logical argument that jumps out at me is that it doesn't really matter how secure it doesn't really matter how secure an election. You can argue that it doesn't matter how secure a selection is if not everyone's voting, because if you're excluding minorities of any nature from an election, that might as well have just compromised its security.
Okay, so I like the way you said that. I think I can reword that or kind of phrase what you said. So you're thinking more of the negative side, though, right?
Yes.
Okay, so I think if I'm understanding you right, you're essentially saying that, I don't know how to word it. Can you actually phrase that in one sentence? I understand what you're saying, but I'm trying to think how to phrase it.
I guess.
Because I don't want to say it doesn't matter. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
By preventing any sort of minority from voting, you are undermining the security of the election. Which I think would actually be more of an affirmative point.
Yeah, I was going to say, but I kind of like what you're saying about this side too. So, okay, let's kind of get something on both based on what you're saying. Preventing minorities from voting. What was the second half of that?
You are undermining the security of the election, which I think works because if they're already arguing that election security is important, then you can say by arguing against voting rights, you're defeating yourself.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that makes sense. And then I kind of like what you started off saying with the negative side about I trying to remember what you said it. Protecting of voting rights should outweigh concerns of maintaining a secure election.
What did I say?
I think you were saying something along the lines of it doesn't matter because if everyone votes and there's voter fraud and it almost undermines the legitimacy of the vote,
Right.
So I guess we can say voting rights are never protected, never fully protected if fraud exists, which it kind of always does. Voting rights are never fully protected when voters. Okay, hopefully you guys can make sense of this because I don't think I'm phrasing it well, but pretty much I'm going to say for the con side, one thing we can definitely think about is how voting rights are never fully protected when voter fraud exists. And especially with today's world, the whole Russia hacking thing is big news, and all of these things are becoming more, not that they're becoming more common, but I think we're becoming more aware of the dangers of them. So kind of bringing that in, I think would be strategic on that end. Okay, what else are you guys thinking?
Well, for me, I'm looking at this and I'm thinking of Georgia, where apparently they had an unsecure server where people's voter IDs and data was stored on. And so by looking at this, I'm kind of confused where in that situation, you're not really making an election secure
Mhm.
but then you also endanger the voting rights of people because their voter data could be potentially tampered with, deleted, that kind of thing.
Mhm. Yeah, it's interesting because I think it's a good resolution because there's two sides to that. I'm trying to think if that would go in the negative or the pro, I guess. I'm going to put it for here for now, so I'm just going to put Georgia voter information. Was the information essentially stolen?
I don't know. They say that they're saying like the data was stored on an unsecure server, so it was like in like some college campus server, and like people could just log on to the
Mhm.
server and just essentially like journalists were logging on and they could technically be tampering with the election data.
Mhm.
Like anybody could.
And so I'm going to put a little note here that, something like this I think would be good to bring in the negative side because it has this sense of urgency that it should be addressed first because, like you said, could it could be easily tampered with. And like I mentioned earlier, just connect it, whatever side you're in, connect it to the world. Why is this important? Why is this something we should care about? All of us should care about as members of society, because protection of voting rights obviously has to do with our constitution and our history, and we worked so hard to get to where we're at. And then obviously this idea of election integrity and security is important as well because it's becoming more and more problematic. Like hacking is becoming easier and easier now. And there's a whole debate just between electronic ballots and paper ballots because there's fraud, I guess, examples within the paper ballots, but also electronic ballots are easier to hack in as well, which can be problematic. So I can actually put that on here, something to think about on, I guess, the negative side. And feel free for anyone to jump in if you have any other ideas.
I felt like about the Constitution that until the main priority is to hear everybody's voice and everybody like gets to vote and like have a say, you're not really representing a democracy.
Good. So constitution. So constitutional right. And I'm trying to think how to phrase that. So I think that's really important because that's one way to connect it back to the judge and back to the larger purpose is that, we're almost undermining democracy if we're not giving everyone the constitutional right. Constitutional right. I was going to say for now, undermining. And then obviously, if you were on the affirmative side, you would be arguing that that's a more important issue than like in this case, I think the main thing that's going for you is if you're on the con side is the sense of urgency that election security is a big thing now. There's something more just kind of more conscientious about. Whereas here, it's this idea of are we losing our constitutional rights and undermining democracy by allowing these things to kind of, I don't want to say like distract us from the constitutional right, but kind of take priority. Anything else anyone's thinking for either side? Okay, so I think it's just a good place to start, just kind of thinking broadly. And again, I'll post it on Classrooms. That way we have it as a means of referring back to and also something we can add on to as well. So, okay, we have about 2 minutes, so perfect. So for next week, I'm going to post this on Classroom now. It's going to be posted in the assignment, but again, if you do it on like a note card or like a handwritten thing, you don't need to actually like attach anything to it. But when we do start writing the case, I will ask that you do it on a Google Doc so that way I can easily leave suggestions and comments. So for next week, pretty much what I'm going to ask you guys to do is to pick one side, so either affirmative or negative, and I want you to pretty much outline what your case would be for that side. So to be clear, you're not writing a case yet, and you're not even researching yet. Because what I want you to think about first, you can actually read about the topic, but what I want you to think about first is what your arguments are going to be. So what do you think your contentions are going to be? And how do you think you're going to logically bring in evidence to support that? Because oftentimes, I think what a lot of us tend to do is we start researching and then we use the evidence to come up with contentions when it really should be the other way around. So try to think first, what would be your three contentions? What would be your strongest arguments? And logically, what are some things you can bring in that would support that? So it's just an outline. You don't need to write anything out yet because next week you'll hopefully get your partnerships and we'll decide among each other which side you're going to do and you'll be able to share what you have. But just to start thinking about what arguments you would like to do on, in this case, a side of your choice. Any questions on that? Okay, so again, feel free to do it on a note card, or if you want to type it up, that's fine. And then that may, or so next week's speech may be based on that, but we'll see from there. Okay, so if that's it, then I guess we're done here. All right. Thank
Bye.
you, gentlemen. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.